Welcome to Understanding the Bible with Pastor Stephen. This is Season 3, Episode 39, Creation Part 2, The Myths. So last time, we talked about the creation story, why it's important and pivotal to our beliefs in the Bible. What is the creation story? Well, basically, it's the literal 6-day creation and 1 day of rest, the week that God gave us. And Adam and Eve were the only humans created. Humans were created on day 6. You can read that story in Genesis 1. It's also retold specifically about Adam and Eve on chapter 2. This time we're going to discuss a couple of myths, but I want to point out that the Bible doesn't say whether or not Adam and Eve had kids while they were in the garden. It doesn't say that Cain, Abel, and Seth were the first 3 kids. But what we're going to get into here is that it does say that Eve was the mother of all living. So God formed Adam and Eve out of the dust of the ground, and the rest of the humanity came from them. The Bible doesn't say how long Adam and Eve lived in the garden before being cast out, but we know it was far less than 130 years. There was no death in the garden prior to Cain killing Abel. God said everything was perfect. There was no death. So Genesis 4:4, and Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. So to burn the fat, you had to kill the animal. So there's death there in Genesis 4, where they were doing the sacrifices already. Abel appears to be a man at this point, and sacrifices were known to him, so he had to have at least hit puberty when all this went down. Now, let's get into the falsehoods about creation. The biggest one that I wanted to cover today was this idea of Lilith, which you may have heard. Now, I first heard about it from witches, okay? And they tend to revere Lilith and say that she was the first wife of Adam and that she had, powers and became a goddess or whatever, and because of problems, Adam ended up getting a second wife, Eve, and I'll show you where it actually came from and when this idea of Lilith was first introduced. But it is clearly false because Genesis 3:20, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. Now, the Bible is from God. Every word is truthful, which means the word all means there were no other humans that came before or after that were not from Eve. So this idea that there was another human prior to Eve is basically a lie of the devil, okay? So the mother of all living proves she was the first human woman. God called the creation of Adam and Eve good and all that he had created, which means if somehow during that 6th day, he had actually created another woman, Lilith, that then became evil. Then at the end of day 6, after Eve was created, why would God say that everything was good? Okay, so again, that would be a lie that the Bible was teaching if Lilith was real. The assumption of a previously created woman that turned evil is the opposite of what the Bible says. Again, the idea of this Lilith would mean that you don't believe God or Jesus because you choose not to believe what Moses wrote at God's direction, and Jesus affirmed that, which we covered last time. So a lot of people will then say, well, then why is Lilith mentioned in the Bible? And I wanted to bring that up because I know you're going to hear that argument if you ever, have this discussion with anyone. It comes in Isaiah 34, verse 14, but you got to read the whole story, the background of it. So Isaiah 34, verse 2, it says, "For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them. He has delivered them to the slaughter." Verse 6, and it continues on like that. "The sword of the Lord is filled with blood, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea." If you go back and you study that, Idumea is the Edom or the Edomites. So this is now God talking about the destruction of the Edomites and what God is going to do to the land. Then you get to verse 13 and 14, and it says, "And thorns shall come up in her palaces," of the Edomites, right? "Nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof, and it shall be an habitation of dragons and a court for owls." Now the word for owls there is a different word than what we're going to hear in the next verse 14. "The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow." Now, satyr is an actual word that is used for one purpose, half man, half goat. And that is where you get Pam and I think Baphomet and a couple of the other demonic beings. They're half man, half goat. Okay, that's what this satyr is referring to. The satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. And the word for screech owl is different than the word for owl in the previous verse. So it's talking about two different beings here. Verse 13 is the standard normal word for owls. Verse 14, when it says screech owl, that's actually the Hebrew word Lilith, or the English transliteration is Lilith. So that's where they get it. And the actual Hebrew translation of the word is not screech owl. The actual Hebrew translation is night specter, which comes from the word turning, a shifting. That's where they get this night specter, Lilith. Different English translations, when I looked through about 12 different English translations, that word, Lilith, is translated as a night monster in most of the translations, a night spirit, a night creature, demon in a couple translations, or Lamia, which in the ancient Hebrew, the tradition of Lamia were apparitions that snatch babies. Then there's only like 3 translations that use night bird or screech owl. I believe the King James did it because they didn't want to give credence to this particular name for a demon. That's just my opinion. That's why they chose screech owl, I think. Translations are bad because people often put their own feelings and ideas and beliefs into the words instead of reading the actual word, because the proper translation would have been, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow, the night specter also will rest there and find for herself a place of rest. So that is all the Bible says about this supposed Lilith. Now I want to read you a note on the Bible from Barnes. He's a great commentator, good translator. And he said that Lilith is a creature of Jewish superstition. The rabbis describe it in the form of a female elegantly dressed that lays in wait for children at night to carry them off to murder them. Now, the Greeks had a similar idea respecting this female, the Impauta, and this idea corresponds to the Roman fables respecting the Lamia, and the Strigus, and the Arabic notion of the ghouls, who they describe as female monsters that dwell in deserts and tear men to pieces. This was a common apparition or night specter across the cultures. So the logical conclusion based on what the Bible teaches about demons, false gods, etc., is that this is either a specific demon, the name of a demon, like, the witches try to tell you that Lilith was some goddess or whatever, or it's a type of demon like the satyr. Like there's several of them that have taken to doing this particular thing. Now I talked about that in season 3, episodes 6, 7, and 8. It's titled Gods, Humans, Aliens, and Ghosts, if you want to look at that. But the whole point of this passage was that God would destroy that place and the Edomites so terribly so that no human would want to live there. It would only be fit for demons to roam and the night creatures. The subpoint of that particular verse is probably that God understood that demons are real and he knows their names and what they do. God's omniscient. This will summarize it for you pretty well from biblicalarchaeology.org. And it says, until the 7th century, Lilith was known as a dangerous embodiment of dark feminine powers. That's why the witches love her. In the Middle Ages, however, the Babylonian she-demon took on a new and even more sinister characteristic. Sometime prior to the year 1000, and I'll show you it's actually around 700 AD, the Hebrew alphabet of Ben Sirah was introduced. This anonymous text, no one knows the actual author, but the name in there is Ben Sirah, and he talks, and so it's a story told by this guy, contains 22 episodes corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The 5th episode includes a Lilith, who was to tantalize and terrify the population for generations to come. To some extent, the alphabet of Ben Sirah shows a familiar Lilith. She's destructive, she can fly, she has a penchant for sex. Yet this tale adds a new twist. She is Adam's first wife, before Eve, who boldly leaves the Garden of Eden because she was treated as man's inferior. So, it was about 700 AD, shortly after the introduction of Islam by Muhammad. Interesting that this came about in the same time period in the same part of the world. Anyway, let me explain to you the alphabet of Ben Sirah. It's a satirical work. The alphabet of Ben Sirah is one of the earliest, most complicated, and most sophisticated Hebrew stories written in the Middle Ages. 4 versions of the work were printed. All the versions have satirical and heretical characters, and the whole semblance of the writings, the 4 different versions, indicate that they were all written by a single person. So the complete work contains 4 parts. The reason there's 4 versions of it is when they popped up in different parts of the world, they were censored. Parts of it were so bad, they were censored out and not allowed to be printed. And so in different parts of the world, we got 4 different versions of this book, the 22 alphabet thing. So the first part is supposed to be the biography of the guy who did it, but it's Ben Sirah from his conception until the age of 1 year old. And this story satirizes and makes fun of the prophet Jeremiah and God's deeds as well. The second part is more sophisticated. It tells how Ben Sirah, now 1 year old, how he meets a teacher who tries to teach him the alphabet. And instead of repeating each letter of the alphabet after his teacher, Ben Sirah responds with an epigram beginning with that letter. The third part is the narrative material. It recounts the story of Ben Sirah's life and adventures in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia. It includes stories told by this character, Ben Sirah himself. These stories often have pornographic elements as well as severe derogatory descriptions of biblical figures like King Solomon or Joshua from the book of Judges. Some of the stories even contain international folklore. It's not just satire of the Bible. Now, the fourth part is what gives the work its name. That has the 22 alphabetically arranged epigrams attributed to Ben Sirah that serve as material for the interpretation of him and his son and his grandson. Again, fictional characters. The contents are very heretical. Scholars believe that the alphabet of Ben Sirah is aimed at ridiculing God more than the person of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Some of the abusive stories are directed against biblical characters. And it seems likely that the author was merely a writer with anarchist tendencies who used satire to ridicule all the institutions of established religion in his day, and the number one religion in 700 AD was Christianity around the world. So the point is simply this. When it comes to the idea of Lilith, why believe a story written 700 years after Christ that was meant to demean God's Bible, his prophets, and his creation? To put it all together, guys, the word Lilith is mentioned in the Bible, and I believe it to describe a demon that probably slaughtered humans, especially babies. Now, that's only hearsay based off other cultures around the world, and that Isaiah clearly used the word to associate with other demons like the satyr, and in context with desolation, judgment, darkness, and fear. Lilith was never created for the Garden of Eden like Eve was. She never was. It never was human. It was not good or perfect like Adam and Eve, and could not have been his first wife because of what the Bible says. That is a heretical story made up by someone choosing to ridicule the Bible around 700 AD. That's what I got. And the second thing I wanted to talk about today was humans outside the garden. Genesis 4:13 through 17, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore whoever slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So he said, people will find me and kill me. The question is raised, what people? If Adam and Eve were the only people, right? Then it says he dwelt in the land of Nod. It seems that there were other civilizations outside the garden is what people raised the question of. Okay, the land of Nod must be a place where people are, right? And then, of course, Cain got a wife. Had to be from somewhere else. Could not have been in the garden because, Cain and Abel were the first two kids of Adam and Eve. Well, that's not true. But then they say, well, doesn't the Bible prohibit sleeping with sisters? Yes, in Leviticus 18. But that's much later, like 1,500 years later when God made that law. So let's use a little bit of logic here. Let's talk about Adam and Eve's age, how many kids they had, and what civilizations they could have started, and how many people there would have been on the earth. Let's talk about Adam and Eve's age. First of all, in Genesis 4:25, it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. So there it's saying he has other kids. It doesn't say when or how many or what their names are, right? And verse 5, and all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So at 130, Adam had Seth after Cain had killed Abel, because Eve said, here's my new son to replace Abel, who was murdered. What that means is that was the first son after Abel was murdered. So we're talking at 130 years old, he had this first son after Abel. So how many years after Abel was murdered do you think he waited to have sex with his wife and conceive another child? That'd be my first question. So assuming Cain killed Abel about 5 years earlier, there would be over 30,000 people on earth. Here's why. With an average rate of one child every 3 years, assuming he has sex with his wife all the time, and, he just misses her ovulation period and they only have kids every 3 years, right? She gets pregnant, 9 months later, she has a kid, and then they wait a year before they have another kid. Let's just say that. Adam and Eve would have 42 kids by the time he was 130. The first two kids would have conceived kids together when they were probably about 19 years old, 18, 19, something like that. They'd start, having kids, because you got to think of when do you hit puberty and when did people first start having sex. If his first two kids were a boy and a girl, 19 years later or 20 years later, they'd both be old enough to be having sex and then have kids. So when Adam is 19, don't forget, at 1 year old or at 1 day old, he was already a man old enough to have a wife, right? So having sex and probably getting pregnant pretty quick. 19 years of sleeping with Eve. If he had a kid every 3 years, he's got 6 kids and now a grandkid's on the way. At 41 years old, Adam and Eve would have their first great-grandchild, 24 grandkids, and 14 kids. At age 47, just 6 years later, they would have 16 kids, over 38 grandkids, and at least 6 great-grandkids, and at 47 years old, Adam and Eve would have their first great-great-grandchild. Then you begin to have exponential growth. I couldn't even do the math after this. But if they had Cain and Abel 50 or 60 years later, say at 100 years old, and then at 20 or 25 he was murdered, and then 5 years later they had Seth, there would literally be thousands, almost 100,000 people. Think about it. Without contraception, with God's command to multiply, this would have probably been much faster if they had twins once in a while, or some people having kids before they turn 18. Some people might have had kids more often than every 3 years. Some people might have had kids every year. More likely, when Cain killed Abel, there were close to 100,000 people on the earth. But at a bare minimum, with a slow birth rate of every 3 years, there'd be over 30,000. If they were in the garden for at least 60 years, all of those offspring probably would have left the garden prior to that and started civilizations outside the garden with couple hundred people, extended families in each little civilization, each little village. If they were kicked out immediately at the garden, then it doesn't even matter, because they would start villages and cities within a very short time with those high birth rates. So what you got to understand about Adam and Eve and other civilizations outside the garden, other people outside the garden, is the Bible story makes it clear that, yeah, they had lots of kids. Whether they were kicked out before they had kids or after they had kids, there would be distant offspring, great, great, great grandkids over the age of 20 that had already moved out of the area and begun to establish their own cultures and families and villages and maybe even small cities further away than that from their great grandfathers that had left the garden. Think about it. If you're in an enclosed culture and someone sees the mountains in the distance, at some point, one of the dudes is going to be like, I'm going to climb that mountain. And he goes over the mountain and he disappears. People are going to explore. People would have moved. Look at the settlement of America and the move westward and how much land we settled. How many cities came about within merely 100 to 200 years? A lot. And that's not even accounting for the high birth rates. And remember, there was no murders until Cain killed Abel. He was the first murderer at about 125 years into all this. So you're not having all these deaths that we had in America. Back then, the people were the same drive to explore, to cultivate and claim land. They would have had the same desires that we have today and that expanded America all the way across the 50 states. In summary, in regards to humans outside of the garden, God only created 2 humans and he told them to fill the earth and multiply. Shortly after they began having sex and babies, there had to have been over 30,000 humans, and they did not all live in the garden. That's just simple logic. By the time Cain killed Abel, and I'm guessing here, when Adam and Eve were 125 years old, there would have been over 100,000 people in multiple cities. And remember, in this time, there was no law from God to not marry your sisters, your cousins, etc., for another 1,500 years, until Moses came about and got the 10 Commandments when they were wandering in the desert. Family married family. It wasn't gross. They didn't know anything else. Plus, they started with the perfect people. So you didn't have the DNA degradation and the extra chromosomes and stuff like that. These people were probably decades apart, may not have known each other until the wedding, probably lived so far apart that you couldn't get there unless you'd hopped on your T-Rex and rode over there and took a couple days journey, or, horse or whatever they rode at the time. Everyone was family on the earth, so it didn't matter. And with lifespans approaching 900 years, it would have been nothing for a 150-year-old person to marry a 20-year-old. They would have both looked young, probably about close to the same age as what everyone would think, because as soon as you hit adulthood, whatever the age that was back then, it didn't matter if you married another adult. So what's 100 years difference when you lived almost 1,000? They'd both be young. And they're so far removed in family that it wouldn't even matter to today's standards. It'd be like your great-great-grand niece's 3 times removed. Even with today's standards, just using simple logic, it's very clear that there could have been many cities all around that region of the world, however far you can explore in 130 years. That's a vast time span before they had that child. And Seth was not the 3rd child. Seth was just the first male after Abel was killed. So you got to keep that stuff in mind. And of course, then going back to Lilith, that if you ever hear about that, that is satanic, demonic. It's not in the Bible at all in regards to the creation story. So I hope that clears up a couple of the myths about creation and what you may have heard in your discussions with other Christians or with people who don't believe the Bible. And next time we're going to be discussing the Big Bang, the gap theory, the origins of life. So I hope you enjoy that. Stay tuned. And until next time, may God bless you all. Well, there you have it. Thank you so much for listening, guys. This has been a pleasure to do. I really enjoy digging into this stuff. I've always liked history and philosophy and other cultures, not to mention religion and where they come from and why people think the way they do. So it's been fascinating for me to study these other ideas that pop up, like the legend of Lilith in the Garden of Eden and such. It's very interesting. I did not even know that until today, that it comes from 700 AD from a satirical work. There was no idea of this stuff until this guy decided to blaspheme God in the Bible and make up this stuff. So I hope you weren't one of those people that have fallen into believing some of those stories. Same as with the Book of Enoch. I found so many errors in the Book of Enoch, and you got to understand, guys, that anything other than the Bible is not from God. Worst case scenario, they're demonic, influencing human beings to write lies to try and convince you to believe them. So if it's not in the Bible, you should offhand be very skeptical and quick to discredit it, as opposed to being quick to believe it. Remember, the Bible is God's word from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Nothing else is. And when you find something else that even has an appearance of proving the Bible wrong, then you have to make a choice. Do you believe the Bible? Do you believe God? Do you believe Jesus? Or are you having doubts and you no longer believe it? You think it's been proven wrong. That's what it comes down to, guys. Who do you have faith in? Me personally, I have my faith in Jesus Christ. I know that he saves, and I look forward to seeing him again. And until next time, may God bless you all.